Learning about learning with Jim.
Yes, we're here again. It's Learning About Learning with me, Jim. Thanks, as always, to Ellie Westbrook for... Sorry, just checking my audio's coming in. Yeah, thanks again to Ellie Westbrook for that lovely intro music. It's a weird snowy day here in the UK. Snowstorms this morning after shorts all last week, so who knows what the hell's going on. But we're here, we're talking about dual coding theory. I don't really have kind of much formal training in learning and education theory. I've kind of developed my practice over 10 years of doing and reading and researching, and that's partly what this project's about, wanting to learn more. And this was suggested by my good pal Tim, who is a trained teacher, primary school teacher. So I imagine dual coding is something they probably do at teacher training school, because in looking into it, seems like it's a big theory. So today we're gonna try to understand what dual coding theory is. Is it useful? Hang on, here's our question. Is it useful? And dual coding is kind of the question it's asking, really, and the question that's important for us as learning designers, learning practitioners. How can different types of stimuli help learners encode information in their brains more effectively? So that's kind of what we're doing here. Sorry, just checking the audio again. Check. And as always, folks watching on LinkedIn or YouTube, give us a shout out in the comments if anything comes up that you agree with, disagree with, want to know more about. I'm just kind of getting my head around this theory, so I might not be able to answer all your questions, but I can certainly bring in insight from what I've read. So let's dive straight into it. Dual coding theory. I started by going back to the source. So Alan Pavio is the kind of originator of dual coding theory. It's been around for, I think, almost 50 years, this theory, but he's updated it over and over again, and the most recent update, I think, is about a decade ago. So still relatively old or relatively recent, depending on what that means to you. But yeah, so I found the kind of this paper from 1991 that's a good intro to the theory. I mean, I say intro, it's 62 pages. But dual coding theory, DCT, in essence, explains human behavior and experience in terms of dynamic associative processes that operate on a rich network of modality-specific verbal and non-verbal or imagery representations. And that imagery in brackets is actually particularly interesting, and we'll get to that a bit later. These non-verbal representations don't necessarily have to be images. They can be all sorts of other things as well. So what Pavio and his collaborator on this paper that I read, James Clark, were trying to do were connect dual coding theory to education, explaining how it's useful for education and teaching. So I've got as always, a beautiful graphic explaining what it means. So what you've got is verbal stimuli. So you've got kind of words that are processed in your brain, often sequentially. So, words come in sentences, so they come in sequence. So we're getting verbal stimuli from the world, and then we're also getting non-verbal stimuli as well. So those verbal stimuli are processed by your verbal kind of processing system in your brain into what he calls logogens, and then the non-verbal stimuli are processed in the non-verbal system into imagens. But the non-verbal stimuli don't have to just be images. They can also be sounds, emotions, actions, tastes, smells, touch. There's all sorts of non-verbal stimuli that we can use and understand to make sense of the world that have relation to the verbal stimuli as well. So yeah, dual coding it kind of posits that there are these two different ways that we get information, use that to understand the world, and those two systems are connected in different ways. So you can see the link between the two there. Referential connections are where join corresponding verbal and imaginal codes. So the classic example that everyone seems to use is the word dog is in the verbal side, the verbal system. And when I say that, you have all sorts of associated kind of referential connections to non-verbal things that connect to the word dog. So I have an image of my dog. I hit maybe a kind of sound memory of a barking dog, smell of a dog, wet dog, all these sort of things. Maybe I've also got kind of feelings and emotions about dogs. Maybe it's a feeling of love and an affection. Maybe it's fear. So referential connections connect the verbal system with the non-verbal system, and there's kind of a dance between those two. And then within each of those systems, there are links called associative connections. So associative connections join representations within the verbal and non-verbal system. So and actually, this kind of connects a little bit back to the some of the work on phonics last week, where we can, like, one of the ways to help kids learn language is through kind of creating these associations. So, verbally, when I say the word dog, other words kind of associated to that. So, dog, hare, run, ball, stick, play, pet. So they would be kind of, as far as I understand, associative connections for the word dog, and then non-verbal associative connections. We've kind of touched on these already. So it would be like the image of a dog, the feel of my hand on kind of stroking a dog's fur, or the smell of a wet dog, or the kind of feeling of emotion of fear when that kind of comes into my head. So that kind of, in essence, is dual coding theory, that these two things are going on at once. And the way it's useful for education and learning is that the theory posits that we're more likely to learn stuff. I mean, this is kind of how it's taken by instructional designers, learning designers, teachers. We're more likely to learn stuff, things more likely to be kind of strongly encoded in our brains, in our memories, if we attend to the verbal and non-verbal stimuli. So most simple version of this is like having a picture of something whilst you also have the words of it, or you're talking about it. Which is interesting. So and these kind of connections, I think a lot of them are kind of implicit in our understanding and representation of the world, which made me think, maybe that has repercussions for how we have thoughts and connections about things that we might not necessarily want. It instantly reminded me of that kind of scene in Clockwork Orange when he's brainwashed into thinking and acting in a different way by receiving images, like, many, many, many images of war and pain and that kind of thing, alongside these kind of this triggering music. So yeah, I mean, a question I have: can we use these associative and referential connections for good or for evil? Like, do we need to think about the kind of the biases that come into play when we're considering these connections? Like, when I say firefighter, okay, that's the verbal stimulus, firefighter. What is the non-verbal image that comes into your head. You know, maybe it's a male firefighter, but also there are female firefighters, and there can be some, you know, some potential problems or barriers when you think about kind of, as an example, gender equality, when we have these kind of embedded associations in our mind between the verbal and the non-verbal. Same with nurse. When I say nurse, you know, certainly a lot of people would think of a woman, but, you know, there are male nurses too. So that was a bit of an aside, but I wonder if there are considerations when we're thinking about verbal and non-verbal systems and what we need to consider in terms of biases, heuristics, that kind of thing. Is the merit in breaking these kind of these connections, these associative connections or referential connections? So I think that's kind of we have a basic understanding of dual coding theory now. He talks about how useful, like kind of what's happening as a child's developing from a dual coding perspective. So this is Paivio's kind of narrative of how these two systems evolve as a child learns to, you know, understand and express representations of the world. So dual coding development begins with the formation of a substrate of nonverbal representations and imagery derived from the child's observations and behaviors related to concrete objects and events and relations among them. So we start to develop all sorts of kind of images, sounds, sights, smells, feelings about the world before the verbal comes into play. Language builds upon this foundation and remains functionally connected to it as referential connections are being formed. So remember, those referential connections are ones between these two systems. As referential connections are being formed so that the child responds to object names in the presence or absence of the objects and begins to name and describe them, even in their absence. So they've got this substrate of understanding, you know, cat, dog, cheese. They recognize those objects, but once the language, the verbal system comes into play, they can refer to those objects, feelings using language, and even when they're not there. The events, relations, and behaviors are dynamically organized, repeated with variations, and thereby display natural syntax that gets incorporated into the imagery as well. The natural syntax is enriched by motor components derived from the child's actions, which have their own patterning. Francisco in the chat, thanks, take a look deeper on it. Yeah, great. The basic stage becomes elaborated as function words are required and intraverbal networks expand through usage. So the kid's starting to develop complexity, you know, learning how to kind of connect the words. So that's creating associative connections within the verbal and non-verbal systems, creating more referential connections between them. Abstract verbal skills are eventually attained so that language becomes relatively autonomous, free of dependence on situational context and imagery. So that kind of verbal side of things, you know, we can have discussions without referring to non-verbal things. So I can talk about feeling upset or angry without actually, you know, being upset or angry. One interesting thing to pull out there is they talked about concrete objects and events. One piece of research I read actually kind of debunked that, and the experimentation they did seemed to suggest that we actually are as good at learning and understanding and kind of processing abstract concepts just as much as we are concrete ones. So, you know, fear and cheese, those, you know, we don't necessarily learn, understand, process the word cheese, a concrete word, more easily just because it's concrete. Actually, we are able to process kind of abstract concepts just as well. So just a kind of little, interesting little point there. I'm not going to go much deeper into that. So that's how dual coding works in theory. As often happens with these theories, what seems to happen is you have the kind of the original theory, which is expanded and developed over time by the theorist, and then it gets taken into a system like the education system, and it gets contorted slightly, probably simplified so people can use it more effectively, but it strays somewhat from the kind of the original intention of the researcher. So there was a paper by Mr. Lawrence called "Why I'm Not Against Dual Coding," but which is fairly actually critical of dual coding. He said Pivio did not seem as interested in the link between verbal and auditory pathway to memory as between verbal and visual, but they remain an important part of learning. And what's interesting about that is, Pivio actually does talk about the importance of things other than visual in that non-verbal system. Like I said, he talks about images, but also sounds, actions, emotions, tastes, touch, all sorts of non-verbal stimuli beyond just imagery. But if you Google kind of dual coding, you'll find some kind of image like this where they talk about you've got the verbal and the visual. So whatever happened over the last few decades, this idea has been quite radically simplified, which then leads to people being quite critical of it. So whilst I think there is quite a lot of nuance in the actual original theory, the way that it seems to have been taken on by teachers, educational professionals, is actually a kind of unfair simplification of the theory. I tried to read this other paper, which featured sentences such as this: the activity in the left lateralized regions, e.g. left inferior frontal gyrus, is suggested to mark for an integrative regulatory or retrieval function, according to Rodriguez, Ferrero et al. So I don't quite understand that, because this, to prove dual coding theory, you need to be, pretty hardcore on your brain science. So I kind of left that stuff a little bit behind. But as I was looking, I was kind of looking for like, what are the alternatives to dual coding theory when we're thinking about ways in which we can understand the world, and subsequently ways in which we as learning designers, learning professionals, can help people to learn stuff. And there's something called propositional representational theory. And propositional representation theory states that mental relationships between objects are represented by symbols and not mental images of the scene. So what they talk about here is, rather than the being the words we use to describe something, and then some non-verbal stimuli, which are all also kind of, they're all kind of physical, sensorial. He's talking about like sight, sound, touch, smell, taste. What propositional representational theory, which was developed by Dr. Zenon Pilshin back in the 70s, and has kind of grounding in, like deep grounding in kind of some philosophical concepts. Basically, they talk about the being this organizing language that sits below the level of culture, that helps us to understand kind of these symbolic propositions about the world, which is pretty like a big concept to grasp. But they use this to elucidate it. So Debbie, the sentence, Debbie donated a big amount of money to Greenpeace. When that thought, or that kind of concept, that proposition emerges in your mind, what you're actually doing is you're connecting kind of three different propositions that exist like below the level of language. Propositions are, Debbie donated something in the past. That's the first proposition. The second one, that it was money, and a big amount of money. The third one, that it was to Greenpeace, who work on the environment to protect the environment. So there are these three concepts that exist in a like pre-lingual form. What they call, there's this term mentalese, which they use to talk about a kind of the language of the mind that exists beyond culture. So that when we have thoughts about things, we're not literally like writing the words in our head. We're not seeing pictures. We're not smelling things. It's something like, there's something before that where we conceptualize these representations of the world, which then come out as language. But for them, it's important to recognize that there is a kind of prelingual mental language that we use to understand and describe the world. Pretty cool, trippy stuff. But I mean, that it feels kind of instinctively right to me. Like, you know, we have these kind of concepts, representations of the world that we can think about without using words or like seeing images in our mind. It's there's something a bit more ephemeral than that. We're at time, so just going to end by thinking like how is this useful for learning design? Because it's a pretty like it's a pretty heavy theory, but how is this useful for learning design? So firstly, it's useful to know that we encode information in our brains in different ways. So even if it's, you know, even if it doesn't represent the totality of what's happening in our brain, not verbal and non-verbal stimuli and verbal and non-verbal systems in our brain is a useful thing to understand as learning designers. So our learners are going to encode information in different ways. So, and one of our jobs is to help people make associations between these verbal and non-verbal systems. So it's not enough to just like talk about something. We also have to show things. People also have to feel something, and we have to attend to that. Maybe there's taste smells going on too, and possibly our job is also to help people in this propositional representation theory form solid propositional representations of the things we're teaching them. So beyond the words and the images and the feelings, when you're learning something, you have to kind of get it deep into the kind of the core of your brain as this kind of abstract representation of what this thing is, to kind of truly learn it. So you're not just, and we talked about this in a very early episode, you don't just have the kind of implicit knowledge where you're able to repeat some words to someone. You actually have to have like this explicit knowledge. Or have I got that the wrong way around? I'm just not enough coffee. Anyway, yeah. So you have to really truly understand these concepts in order to be able to use them. And I think there's something connected there to these propositional representations, where once you've really like internalized something, you can then kind of be said to have learned it and use it effectively. So practically, you know, this means creating a variety of media for people, telling compelling stories. So people can create those referential connections and associative connections that, you know, tapping into the kind of natural storytelling of the human brain. Clear explanations for people, helping them make connections to things they already know. So again, like if these connections between and within the two systems are really important, we need to support people to make those connections so they can situate the thing we want them to learn within the kind of constellation of knowledge that they already have. Connected to that is kind of them actively working with the material or the concept or the ideas that we're trying to teach them. And then I think back to a classic old kind of learning theory, like effortful retrieval. So to strengthen those connections and to make that knowledge really explicit, we need to get people to kind of put some effort in, make sense of it for themselves, retrieve that knowledge from their brains and do something useful with it. Okay, little over. Thanks for your comment, Francisco. And lovely to have been here with you all, digging into dual coding. I think, yeah, I'm on holiday for the next couple of weeks, so I'll be back in back in 3 weeks with perhaps something a bit more like, organizational learning design focused, because we've gone on a bit of a theory rabbit hole here. Yeah, great. Thanks for watching, gang. Stay safe out there in the snow, and I'll see you soon.